So last week I mentioned that I'm not a big fan of bubbles. In fact, bubbles for most of my life have pretty much annoyed me. And then as a father of young children, they became even more annoying. And so I've set out on a journey, on a mission. I think we need to pop bubbles. Even though there was someone that shared a story with me last week that said that they had a convertible, or I can't remember if it was a convertible or if they had like a sunroof or something, and they drove down the street one day blowing bubbles out of the convertible or out of the sunroof. And there was just joy from people all around that were seeing the bubbles. And they're like, oh, that's so cool. Which actually made me think, okay, in that scenario, bubbles aren't too bad. But in the way that I described them last week as bubbles, as things that we put around ourselves, we create our own bubbles. They're not good. And yet, as I stand here today, even like the actual bubbles, picture this, like a guy my age, maybe somebody, in their 30s or 40s, walking around popping bubbles. How satisfying would that be? Pop, 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 getting rid of all the bubbles. And then I can picture all the little kids crying as this grown man is popping their bubbles. And yet today, I'm going to argue that I think we actually need to be bubble poppers. Not in the sense where we're popping the bubbles of young kids that are blowing bubbles, that we need to be bubble poppers in a different sense. Last week, a friend of mine, Dan Polke, commented on the video that Jesus was a bubble popper, and it got me thinking, yes, he is. He is a bubble popper. Why? Because he went and popped the bubbles that bother me the most, and those are the bubbles we put around ourselves to either protect ourselves or to not let things in. I don't know what it is. We all have different reasons, and yet we create these bubbles. And yet Dan said Jesus was a bubble popper. Jesus was a bubble popper. In fact, there's two very specific stories in Scripture where Jesus popped bubbles. First one is, and both of these are fairly well known. If you've ever read the Bible, or if you've been in church for a while, you've probably read these stories or heard people talk about these stories. But the first one was with this woman at the well. She was a Samaritan, Jesus was a Jew. In those days, they didn't mix. The Jews and the Samaritans, they didn't talk to each other, they didn't deal with each other. Jesus was a man, she was a woman. She walks up to this well and she's about to get water. And you see Jesus pop the bubble. Why do I say he popped the bubble? Jesus initiated the conversation. In fact, he starts talking to her and says, hey, can you get me some water? And she looks at him, shocked. Are you a Jew talking to me, a Samaritan? And he's like, yes, I am. And the conversation continues, and it comes to the point where Jesus calls out who this woman was and says, this is exactly who you are, and this is where you've been, and this is what you've done. And she stands there in awe and says, truly, you must be a prophet. And he says, if you drink of the living water, you will thirst no more. And she says, how do I get it? And he says, believe in me. She ran away from that moment and said, listen, I found this man, and he told me everything about me. And he said I could have living water. See, Jesus popped the bubble. Second time he did that, you see specifically in the story of Zacchaeus. And you see once again a very similar situation. Jesus, who was a rabbi, was someone that should not have been associating with Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector. He was a sinner. He was a horrible person, at least in the eyes of individuals that would have been following Jesus. But guess what? Jesus did the same thing with Zacchaeus he did with the woman at the well. He initiated the conversation. He started the conversation. He popped the bubble. He said, Zacchaeus, I'm going to your house. And when he got there, Zacchaeus said, what do I do? And Jesus said something very similar to the woman. Believe in me. And Zacchaeus says, I do. See, Jesus was a bubble popper. We need to be bubble poppers. And the way that he popped bubbles was with a very specific form, with a very specific way. And that was through love. What's the best way to pop bubbles? With love. See, we create these bubbles around ourselves to protect ourselves oftentimes because we don't want to be hurt. We don't want to let people in. We don't want to let ideas in that may cause pain. And yet, what if we lived in a world where we walked around popping bubbles? Not the actual bubbles, but the bubbles, the fake bubbles, and yet the real bubbles that we put around ourselves. And we did it with love. See, when Jesus did it, he started a conversation with people he shouldn't have been talking to. But he started those conversations because he loved them. He said, hey, I have something you need to hear. So today, let's commit to being bubble poppers. Let's be like Jesus. Let's be the initiators. Let's start the conversation because we love. And we have something just like Jesus that people need to hear. A message, not about ourselves, but about the one that we've met because he popped our bubble and said, hey, come follow after me. So through this Christmas season, as we interact with individuals, wherever you may be going, go ahead, pop some bubbles using love and tell them about the reason for this season so that through us, they can see Jesus. Have a great week.